Hey folks, thanks again for tuning in. This week we have a couple of one-offs, and then we're going to be spending some time in the German New Wave. I'd like to just give this one warning up front though. I'm going to be exploring some uncomfortable territory, specifically regarding the actress Nastasha Kinski for the film Wrong Move. So if you're triggered by anything involving sexual exploitation of underage young teens, that may be something you want to skip over. So in case you want to skip that section, I'm going to detail the time codes in the description below for that part. Now that that's out of the way, let's just jump back in.
A bunch of degrees of Kevin Bacon down the Kevin Bacon rabbit hole.
Brad Dourif is now going to pull us into a Spike Lee joint.
Thought you were gonna drop a bomb.
Well, she's white.
White! Man, are you on crack or something? You crazy!
She's Italian.
Wesley Snipes plays Flipper Purify, a successful black architect from Harlem. Flipper seems to have a happy marriage, great family, and decent job. But we all know that can't last, otherwise we wouldn't be watching a movie. Flipper's secretary quits, and his bosses, whom he seems to butt heads with a decent bit, decide to hire Angie, an Italian-American. The problem Flipper has with this is that he made it clear to his bosses that, as the only black man in the office, he would like another person of color to fill the position. This problem, though, doesn't seem to be too much of a problem for long, as Flipper and Angie begin to work late together, flirt, and he decides to fill her position. This relationship obviously comes with many complications, and like any romantic drama that deals with infidelity, we experience a decent share of screaming matches. Like most of Spike Lee's films, this is rich with a myriad of subjects impacting the black community. Race is almost always a central theme for Lee, but what I think is so great about him is that he tackles a complex subject from different angles and points of view. In the instance of Jungle Fever, one of the biggest themes that boils to the surface is colorism that many black people experience when it comes to sexual attraction, for example.
I was always the darkest one in my class, and I know you know what I'm talking about. All the guys ran after the light-skinned girls with long, straight hair, and that left me out. And it's that same kind of thinking that leaves us out when it comes to white women. Now, back in the day, brothers would get sisters that looked like you, Drew, and you, Vera, you know? But now, light skin ain't even good enough.
The cast is great. This features probably my favorite Wesley Snipes performance. And I'm noticing a type here with Ossie Davis, who I love, but Lee seems to often typecast him as a heavy-handed Christian zealot.
With your permission, sir, I think we ought to ask that the Creator should travel with us.
Or at least a moralizing older mentor character.
What?
Always do the right thing.
That's it?
That's it.
Anthony Quinn plays a truly despicably racist Italian-American father. And you know it's interesting to me, Quinn was Mexican, but I feel like I've mostly only seen him play Italian characters. And, okay, maybe a Greek. Anyways, as they say, too much of a good thing is not always a good thing. For example, Samuel L. Jackson plays Flipper's drug-addicted brother Gator. He's a fantastic character, but this subplot seems to distract from the film's more pronounced themes and ends up dragging the pace a bit. I believe losing this little piece of the story could have shaved an unnecessary 10 to 15 minutes out of the film. One side note, I don't really know how to segue into this, but I have to mention there's a shocking turn of events that come out of nowhere in the last few minutes of the film. Seriously, it was one of the biggest WTF endings I've seen in a while. Part of me feels like Lee was trying to drop one of those, quote, open to interpretation endings, but it was just maybe a little spicier than I was prepared for. Given that I'm focused on this rabbit hole, I haven't had time to follow any YouTube trails analyzing this ending, but there's gotta be something out there. If you happen to know off the bat what the hell it's all about, or have your own take on the ending, I'd love to hear it in the comments. So, verdict. Given that this was not long after Do the Right Thing, I can understand it being a little lost in the shuffle of Spike's canon. Do the Right Thing also tackles a ton of themes and characters, but without spoiling anything for those who haven't seen it, there's a central climactic event in that film which weaves all of the themes and characters together. Jungle Fever spreads the net perhaps a little too far and thus doesn't pack the same punch. Perhaps if Spike had cut one or two of the subplots, developed some of the familial tensions a bit more, and created a heavier climax, it could have really been a banger, but as it is, it's a mostly good mixed bag. Now Ruby D shall escort thee into the world of cat people.
You tell yourself that it's love. But it isn't. It's blood. Death. You can't escape the nightmare without me. And I can't escape without you.
This film is a remake of the 1942 horror film of the same name, but in this instance, Paul Schrader takes the subtle sexual themes from the original and makes them incredibly blatant. So yeah, this definitely falls into the category of erotic horror. Nastasha Kinski plays Irina, a diffident young French-Canadian woman who visits her brother Paul, good old Malcolm McDowell, in New Orleans. We find out that the two were separated when they were orphaned at a young age and thus barely have a relationship. When her brother goes missing, his housemate Female encourages Irina not to worry about it and to explore the town on her own. After visiting the zoo, however, Irina meets a particular zookeeper, played by Kevin McAllister's dad, with whom she strikes a bit of a fancy. He ends up offering her a job at the zoo, and this all sort of works to be a catalyst to a strange sequence of events, which eventually burgeons into a plot about, you guessed it, people who shapeshift into cats. You know, cat people. There's quite a bit of intricate myth I'm glossing over here, but I'm being intentionally vague as not to spoil too much. I've only seen a handful of films that Paul Schrader has directed before, and for the most part I think he's a great filmmaker. The atmosphere of this film is pretty rad, and the synth score is bitchin'. It has some moody, trance-like, borderline psychedelic overtones that remind me a lot of Last Temptation of Christ, which Schrader wrote, but Scorsese directed. Being that this film came first, I'm actually curious if Scorsese lifted some of the stylism we see here, especially for his desert sequences. There's definitely a cheeseball factor to this film that I feel is a bit of a trademark aesthetic for a lot of 80s horror, but it's also quite effectively disturbing. And as you can maybe see here, some of the human-cat antics are a little bit unintentionally funny. Maybe it's intentional, I don't know. It's kind of a weird tone. As I alluded to earlier, this film is heavy on the erotic element, to the point of, for me, being a little uncomfortable. For anybody who finds themes of incest triggering, this may not be a good pick for you. There's a pretty disturbing brother-sister dynamic at play. There are a handful of shockingly violent moments as well, but if you can stomach it, the eroticism mixed with the animal instinct theme works as a compelling deconstruction of human duality between cruel primitive instinct and human love. All in all, this movie's a bit niche to its genre, but if you're a fan of that kind of thing, which I sort of am, it might tickle your fancy. Oh, and as a cherry on top, David Bowie sings the theme song, because of course he would.
I've been putting out fire.
Nastasha Kinski will now be bringing me overseas to the German New Wave of the 1970s.
Das gibt's vielleicht auch, dass man schreiben will, ohne zu wissen was. Einfach nur schreiben wollen, so wie man gehen will.
Wim Wenders is a director who made two films I would easily rank amongst my favorites. I'm quite unfamiliar with the rest of his work, particularly his early stuff, so here's a chance to get acquainted. Wrong Move, or False Movement if we go by the literal German title, is an updated version of the late 18th century Goethe novel, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Also, as it turns out, this film functions as the middle film in Wenders' road movie trilogy. And to clarify, I haven't seen either of the other films, but their relationship is only thematic, so I don't feel too bad about diving randomly into the middle. This is one of those coming-of-age films, which, if you followed my series from the beginning, you'll recall I'm not really too keen on. But I'm always open to new adventures, bias notwithstanding. Wilhelm is an aspiring young writer who leaves his mother and girlfriend in a journey towards a town in North Germany. Along the way, Wilhelm encounters other travelers, some who feel inclined to tag along on the journey. And honestly, that's about as deep as the plot goes. It's an exploratory piece that's mostly plotless and relies on the development of these characters as they travel and interact. It sort of reminded me a bit of a Richard Linklater film. Perhaps that's just because it involves a train ride in Europe and young travelers meeting by chance and pseudo-philosophizing. Though I'd definitely say Linklater would later on nail this kind of film far better than Wenders does here. Perhaps it's because it's a little niche to the young German generation of this time, but it felt a little clunky and not particularly engaging to me. However, about halfway through, a moment of synchronicity begets a meeting with a man in crisis when the travelers stumble into the wrong house. There is a bit of a sweet little subplot that developed here, but it's not very long before this takes a dark turn. I do love the score. It's very melancholy, almost creepy, and it's shot very well. But now, I've been dreading talking about this, but I have to. There's a particular scene that shocked me so much on a gut moral level that it pretty much ruined the entire experience. It involves Nastasha Kinski, who, by the way, is a mute character, and actually to me is the most interesting character of everybody in the film. Now, in the previous film, one thing I forgot to mention was how Kinski was furious that Paul Schrader took advantage of her and made questionable moves in the final cut of the film against her wishes in regards to what full frontal scenes he was actually going to show and just some of the weird sex stuff that she wasn't comfortable with. There's a scene in this house where Wilhelm approaches who he thinks is Therese, another character in the traveling entourage he fancies, but it turns out to be Mignon, Kinski's character. And we see her, meaning Kinski, who was only 13 years old at the time, topless in a sexual scenario. Wilhelm does push her away and reprimand her with a slap, but I just have such a huge problem with filming a girl that young in the nude, especially in a context that does not justify it.
Das ist kein Kind mehr.
Yes, she fucking is. This was actually Kinski's first film and she'd modeled beforehand, but all of this is just a big yuck and a big no-no for me. I realize that I'm speaking as an American in 2020. This was Europe in the 70s. I know it's often argued that they have a, quote, more libertine approach to nudity and sexuality, but I don't really think I can come around on this one. I mean, I don't know what German laws were about these kinds of things, but either way, come on man, this ain't Bible times. Now, as somebody who aspires to be as fair as possible and get the full context of the situation, I tried to track down interviews with Nastasia Kinski to see what she feels about all of this. I couldn't find anything specific to this film, but Kinski has stated that she felt exploited in her early films and that if she had better self-esteem and somebody by her side to protect her, she would not have given in to certain demands. I'm not out to hashtag cancel them vendors, but I just really find all of this quite concerning. It's not quite Roman Polanski territory, but I think it's flirting towards that. From an artistic standpoint, I don't even think this scene is essential to the plot. It could survive just fine and lose not an inkling of its artistic merit. And if Vim really felt it was, she could have had a shirt on at the very least. So yeah. I was already pretty middling to meh on this film to begin with, but my moral issues, especially realizing how much Kinski was taken advantage of as a minor, pushed me into having to outright condemn this film. I can't say it's void of artistic merit, and there are aspects of it that I did quite enjoy, but I'm just so utterly disappointed with Vim vendors for this. Obviously, I say skip it, you're really not missing too much anyway. Hanna Schigula is the next link. She's going to connect me to another German New Wave filmmaker that I've seen far too little of, Rainer Werner Fassbender in The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant.
Ach, ja. Sie haben eine gute Figur. Sie müssten Chancen haben. Vielleicht melden Sie sich mal bei mir. Gerne. Kari, ich komme.
Here's what we might call a chamber film, which takes place entirely in a single location, and the majority of it actually in the bedroom of the central character, whose name I'm sure you can guess. Petra is a fashion designer, and the story examines the revolving relationships she has with other women. The cast is all female. The only other consistent character is Marlene, who acts as her assistant, secretary, slave? Not quite clear. Marlene seems to be mute, and hey, random connection to the previous film, right? A German film with a side character that's mute? Am I reaching on this? Probably. Anywho, Marlene does have a couple lines, but I think I counted like 3, and they're very short. She's always at the whim of Petra, and this is quite a disturbing tell on Petra's character. The set design is protruding with symbolism. She's surrounded by artificiality, mannequins, dolls, etc., whom we share plenty of screen time with. Not to mention a giant mural on one wall that's an oversized reproduction of Poussin's Midas and Bacchus. And though there aren't any men to be found in this film, there's almost always a penis hanging out in the background. A great deal of the plot surrounds Petra's relationship with Karen, who is introduced to her by her cousin. There's a clear obsession that Petra develops for her, which quickly turns unhealthy. Surprise, surprise. Throughout the film, we unravel bits of Petra's tragic past, which may explain some of her off-putting behavior. There is some punctuation between the film's different acts, visually, because Petra's wig keeps changing, and she sometimes looks wildly different from her previous look. I imagine this has some symbolic correlation between the different stages of her character, but sadly I couldn't really put my finger on what it was. At the end of the day, I'm sad to say I didn't find it all terribly compelling. As a surface level criticism, I'll say that being stuck in the same room for the whole time wasn't the most exhilarating experience given the, well, you know, current circumstances. Beyond that, I had a tough time sympathizing for the characters. There were some elements of the story that did eventually click for me, but it took an awful long time to do so. The final 10 minutes I thought were pretty solid, but I did a lot of eye rolling up until that point. To be blunt, this seems like the kind of film that your average Philistine would use as a whipping boy to make fun of the, as they say, pretentious art film. Some shots are a little snobby art school. And then like, oh, mannequins, like, you know, like we're all fake. Art on the wall, we get it, you're cultured. And then we're stuck in this room just like we're all stuck in life. And all this relationship angst, it's tearing me apart, Lisa. I kid, kind of. I do suppose it's somewhat groundbreaking in being a film about a lesbian relationship in 1972, but from where I sit, it didn't really seem to paint a flattering picture either. Though being fair, this may be particularly due to social dynamics. Fassbender himself was a gay man, so I know he attempted to explore this theme from different angles in his work. Though I felt personally a bit distanced from the dynamics at play, from what I can tell this is a piece that seems as though it speaks deeply to the queer experience. What I perceive as melodrama might just be subject to my own perspective as a straight man, so I'm inclined to give this film the benefit of the doubt for some of the artistic risks it takes, but emotionally and philosophically, it's no Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I definitely do need to see a lot more Fassbender. The dude died super young at 37, and in his short life had such a prolific career it rivals filmographies of Ingmar Bergman and Woody Allen, so that alone is impressive. This is not a bad film by any stretch, but definitely my least favorite of the Fassbender films I've seen thus far. Eva Mattes is now bringing me into Werner Herzog Land, and I am overjoyed because he's one of my all-time favorites.
Ordnungsgemäß das Signal und ordnungsgemäß das Akkordeon.
Wunderbar.
Bruno wird jetzt ein Signal durchstehen. Denn der Bruno, der geht jetzt in Freiheit.
From the first minute or so of this, you can see that Bruno STROSZEK is quite the character. After being released from prison and made to promise that he will cease drinking thenceforth, what does he do immediately? After having to endure merciless bullying from an entourage of assholes he keeps encountering, Bruno befriends Eva, a prostitute who's also encountering hard times. They soon join his neighbor, Scheitz, an eccentric older fella, on a journey to America, specifically Wisconsin, where they believe a better life awaits. The bizarre ensemble of personalities almost makes me feel a vibe similar to a German Napoleon Dynamite, and so I frankly had a blast with the weirdness. There are a lot of sequences where people are speaking to each other in their native tongues, but sort of just faking like they understand each other when they're truly stammering to themselves in their own world, and just hoping the other person more or less understands. I don't often see films in a semi-modern context reflecting the full experience of European immigrants before and after their migration, so it was fun seeing the evolving cultural dynamics, or I suppose, lack thereof. I can see why this may have been Herzog's gateway into American culture. There seems to be a fascination with the absurdity of rural America, and hoo boy does it get silly.
Not that motherfucker, huh? Boys, I feel good. Eli, get me a beer.
Even though Bruno is a bizarre, unrefined plebeian character, he's almost excusable in the context of redneck American culture. See, Bruno tries to work as a mechanic, Eva tries her hand at waitressing at a local diner, while Scheitz does something or other about animal magnetism. And these ventures don't necessarily bode the best for all the characters involved. Bruno eventually becomes fed up with America and its false promises, so he reverts to his old criminal ways. Being a tragic comedy, this keeps one foot in reality while leaning heavily into absurdity. Bruno S., the actor, I need to actually specify because all of the main characters go by their true names, especially gives a wonderfully peculiar performance. This was only his second, and actually his final time acting, but he's an incredibly memorable performer. Herzog's films often deal with lead characters who seem a bit mentally off. Once during a Q&A, I heard somebody ask him why he's drawn to, quote, psychotic characters, and Herzog corrected them, saying his characters are never psychotic, but rather misguided. This word has stuck with me for years. Whenever I see the failings of characters in his films, they often engage in awful behavior, but I can never feel like they are entirely to blame, since they are often ostracized by society for their intrinsic otherness. I see Bruno in this film as perhaps the quintessential archetypal example of this. I was pleasantly surprised, even as a longtime Herzog fan, how much I loved this film. The ending is just so good, and demonstrates how the American dream is but a fantasy to many who buy into its promises without understanding its dark, lonely, ugly underbelly. Well, that concludes our journey this week. I just have one more video left, so be sure to join me soon for the home stretch. And don't forget to do me the 3 usual favors of liking, subscribing, and spreading my content to the masses. You can go now.